They fired me for being too old. That's not my interpretation of what happened. Those were, almost word for word, the words used in the room, dressed up in softer corporate language, but not soft enough that I couldn't hear what was actually being said underneath it. 6 months later, 3 of the people who sat in that room called me, one after another, over the course of a single terrible week, asking if there was any way, any amount of money, that could convince me to come back and save the company from a collapse they had built with their own hands. My name is Marguerite. Everyone at the office called me Margo, except for the new leadership team that came in during my last 2 years there, who mostly seemed to avoid calling me anything at all if they could help it. I was 59 years old when I lost the job I had spent 22 years building at a mid-sized industrial supply company called Corrigan Brannock, where I ran supply chain operations for the entire Eastern distribution network. I want to explain what that actually meant, because titles like supply chain operations sound abstract until you understand what they cover. I was the person who knew, in granular and often unglamorous detail, why certain vendors got paid on certain days, which regional warehouses were quietly running below safety stock thresholds, which supplier relationships were held together by nothing more than a decade of trust and a handshake agreement that had never been formally documented because the man who made it had retired years earlier. I was, in the most literal sense, the institutional memory of that company's entire physical supply system. Not because I was irreplaceable in some mystical sense, because nobody else had bothered to write any of it down, and I had never been asked to. The trouble started when Corrigan Brannock was acquired by a private equity-backed holding group 2 years before I was let go. The new ownership brought in a young executive named Trent Whitfield as the incoming Chief Operations Officer, a man in his early 30s with an impressive resume built mostly on companies he'd helped restructure and then quickly left. Trent had a specific philosophy, one he articulated openly in his first all-hands meeting, about what he called generational refresh. He talked about legacy systems and legacy thinking in the same sentence so often that it became difficult to tell whether he meant our aging software or the people who understood it. I felt the cold pit form early. It wasn't one incident. It was a slow accumulation of small signals, the way frost creeps across a window pane from the corners inward. I stopped being invited to strategy meetings I'd attended for a decade. My reports started being requested through an intermediary rather than directly. In a company-wide presentation about building the operations team of the future, Trent showed a slide with stock photography of young professionals in a glass-walled office, and somebody, I never found out who, laughed just loud enough for me to hear it from the back row. The termination meeting happened on a Wednesday morning in February. Trent wasn't even the one who did it. He sent an HR director named Colette, a woman maybe 15 years younger than me who looked genuinely uncomfortable the entire time, to deliver language about restructuring the operations division to align with a more dynamic, forward-facing organizational model. When I asked directly, because 22 years earns you the right to ask directly, whether this had anything to do with my age, Colette didn't answer with words, she just held eye contact a half-second too long. And that silence told me everything the paperwork wouldn't. I didn't cry in that room. I want to be honest that I felt something colder than sadness, a kind of stillness settling into my chest, the particular quiet that comes right before a person stops reacting and starts calculating. I signed my severance paperwork, which included a fairly standard non-disparagement clause and a modest package based on my tenure, and I walked out of a building I had walked into nearly every weekday morning since I was 37 years old. What Trent and the new leadership team didn't understand, because they had never asked, was the true scope of what they had just walked away from. 22 years of supplier relationships that existed as much on personal trust as on formal contract. A complete, unwritten map of which of the company's 41 regional warehouses had structural issues nobody had reported up the chain, because I had always just quietly handled it. A private, informal understanding with our single largest raw materials supplier, a man named Owen Castellano, who had done business with me on a handshake basis since before Corrigan Brannock had ever formalized a vendor management department. None of that lived in a database. All of it lived in me, and I had never once been asked to document it, because for 22 years nobody thought they needed to. I went home that first week and did something I hadn't done in over 2 decades. I let myself rest, and underneath the rest, quietly, my mind kept working, the way water keeps moving even under a frozen surface. I wasn't plotting anything in those early weeks. I genuinely wasn't. I was just watching, from the outside now, as a company I had helped build for over 2 decades started making decisions without the person who understood why things had been done a certain way in the first place. The first sign of trouble reached me through an old colleague, a warehouse manager named Priscilla, who still called occasionally just to check in. She mentioned, almost in passing, that shipments to the Midwest distribution hub had started arriving late, then very late, then not at all for nearly 2 weeks. I didn't ask questions. It genuinely wasn't my business anymore, and I want to be clear that I never went looking for information about my former employer. I simply happened to still know people who talked to me. By month 4, the story had become harder to avoid because it started showing up in trade publications I still read out of habit. Corrigan Brannock had lost its largest raw materials contract. Owen Castellano, the supplier I'd worked with for over a decade, had quietly moved his business to a competitor after what he described in one brief industry newsletter quote as a breakdown in the relationship management he'd come to expect. I understood immediately what had happened, even without anyone telling me directly. Nobody at the new leadership team had known that my relationship with Owen wasn't backed by any contract with teeth. It was backed by 2 decades of me personally making sure his invoices were never late, his concerns were never ignored, and his calls were never routed through 6 layers of corporate hierarchy before reaching a decision maker. Without me there to maintain that relationship, it simply dissolved, the way any unwritten agreement does when the person who carried it in their memory is no longer in the room. By month 5, 2 of the 41 regional warehouses I used to manage had failed safety compliance inspections, the kind of issue I had quietly flagged and resolved for years through informal relationships with regional inspectors and small, timely maintenance investments that never made it into any formal risk report because I'd simply always just handled it before anyone above me needed to know there had been a problem. The call started in month 6. The first one came from Colette, the HR director who had delivered my termination, her voice noticeably different now, careful and almost pleading, asking if I would be willing to come in for what she called a consulting conversation. I let that call go unanswered for 2 days, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely needed the time to decide how I wanted to handle this. The second call came from Trent himself. I want to describe his tone carefully because it's worth savouring honestly. 6 months earlier, this was a man who had stood in front of the entire company and joked, not so subtly, about legacy thinking. Now his voice had a thin, brittle quality to it, the sound of someone doing arithmetic he didn't want to do out loud. He told me the company had lost its largest supplier, that 2 warehouses were facing potential closure over compliance failures, that the board was asking pointed questions about operational continuity, and that they were prepared to offer me a short-term consulting arrangement at, and I remember this number precisely, 4 times my previous hourly rate. The third call, 2 days later, came directly from the private equity firm's managing partner, a man I had never once spoken to during my entire 22 years at the company, because people at that level didn't typically speak with supply chain operations managers. He used the word critical 3 times in a 4-minute conversation. Critical relationships, critical timeline, critical for the fund's confidence in the leadership team going into their next reporting quarter. I said yes, not because I felt any loyalty pulling me back, and not out of some need to prove anything to Trent or Colette or the managing partner whose name I'd never bothered to learn while I worked there. I said yes because the terms were, frankly, excellent, and because there is a very specific, very quiet satisfaction in being paid 4 times your former rate to fix problems that exist entirely because someone decided your decades of experience were disposable. I structured the consulting engagement carefully, short-term, clearly scoped, paid weekly, in advance, because I had learned enough about this leadership team's judgment over the previous 2 years not to extend them any unnecessary trust. I flew to meet Owen Castellano in person, not as an employee this time, but as an independent consultant representing the company's interests, and I rebuilt that relationship on terms that were, this time, actually written down in a contract with real protections because I made sure of it personally. I walked the compliance teams through the informal maintenance protocols I'd carried in my head for years, and for the first time in the company's history, all of it went into a proper documented system, one that would outlast any single person's memory going forward. I want to be honest about something. Part of me considered simply saying no to all 3 calls and letting the consequences of their decision play out fully. There would have been a certain justice in that too. But I chose the consulting engagement instead, because watching Trent Whitfield sit across from me in meetings, visibly deferring to guidance from the very kind of legacy thinking he'd mocked 8 months earlier, was its own form of resolution. He never apologized directly. People rarely do. But he stopped making jokes about generational refresh, and in every meeting after that, he took notes when I spoke, carefully, like someone finally understanding what he should have understood all along. My consulting arrangement ran for 4 months. I helped stabilize the 2 warehouses facing compliance closure. I helped restore the Castellano-supply relationship, this time on paper, in a contract I helped negotiate myself. And when the engagement ended, I left again, this time entirely on my own terms, with a payout that made the severance package Colette had handed me 8 months earlier look almost laughable by comparison. I think about that termination meeting sometimes, the silence when I asked Colette directly whether my age was the reason. I don't feel anger when I think about it anymore. Mostly I feel a kind of settled clarity, the understanding that a company can write off 22 years of accumulated knowledge as legacy thinking right up until the moment that knowledge is the only thing standing between them and collapse. They thought they were removing an expense line. What they were actually doing was removing the only person who knew where all the load-bearing walls were hidden inside a building everyone else assumed was just drywall. Some people play checkers, moving fast and loud, mistaking speed for strength. I was always playing something slower and quieter. I was playing the long game, and it turns out 22 years of institutional memory is not something you can replace with a slide about the operations team of the future.